Welcome to Fanfield Fiction. Today's video is on what is quite possibly my favorite franchise ever. That's right, the one, the only,
Bond. James Bond.
often imitated, never duplicated, James Bond is the suave secret agent. Of course, as Galahad in Kingsman the Secret Service said.
I always felt the old Bond films were only as good as the villain.
So today, we're looking at my personal ranking, from worst to best, of the major James Bond villains. This list only takes into account the major villains, the big bads of their respective movies, so we won't be including admittedly awesome characters like Jaws, Oddjob, or Xenia Onatopp. No henchmen today, just the big villains. A further stipulation, I'm including classic Blofeld and reboot Blofeld as two separate entries, as they feel different enough to me to warrant two different spots on the list. Also, I will only be covering the core films, the Eon Productions movies, so no Never Say Never Again or 1967's version of Casino Royale. This is my personal ranking. I'm not saying that this is objectively correct, but it's how I place the villains. I'll be taking into account personality, plan, any iconic aspects about the characters, and, of course, my own personal likes and dislikes. If you disagree with this ranking, or if I rank your favorite villain low on the list, please remember this is not a personal attack on anyone, and feel free to comment down below what your ranking would be. It should go without saying for a list like this, but there will be major spoilers for every single Bond movie. It's no secret that I'm not a huge fan of the Craig-era Bond films. I love Daniel Craig as an actor, he's a very talented individual, but his tenure as Bond never landed as well with me. The worst of his villains, in my opinion, was Dominic Green from Quantum of Solace. The whole conceit of Quantum of Solace was that they couldn't get the rights to the iconic Spectre organization, so they made up their own, Quantum, and Green was a high-ranking member. Green feels to me like a weaker, more watered-down, pun intended, version of Blofeld, and when the studio got the rights to use Spectre in 2015, Quantum was retconned as little more than a subdivision of Spectre. Green's plan was to acquire control of Bolivia's water supply, supposedly the country's most valuable asset, so that Quantum could control the country. Secondary was establishing General Medrano as the country's leader so that Quantum could control the politicians as well. Green ultimately fights Bond in a one-on-one fight in a burning building, and while he holds his own for a bit, he's no match for the juggernaut that is James Bond. For me, Green has two iconic moments, his murder of MI6 agent Strawberry Fields and his own death, but even these aren't great. Strawberry Fields' death by being drowned in and covered by oil feels like a ripoff of Goldfinger's murder of Jill Masterson by covering her entirely in gold. His death, while brutal, Bond leaves him in the desert with nothing but motor oil to drink, happens entirely off-screen. Ultimately, Green just doesn't do much for me as a villain. He really feels more like a henchman the more we know about him, and while that can absolutely work if handled right, we'll see that later, it just doesn't work for Green.
Spend the money quickly, Mr. Bond.
Kamal Khan from Octopussy is a man of refined, elegant tastes, which makes sense as he is an exiled prince. He's clever, not above cheating to get what he wants, case in point his loaded dice, and is, at his core, a cruel man. Khan's goal is revenge for a perceived slight by Western Europe, and he attempts to pull this off by working with the Soviet madman General Orlov, who intends to detonate a nuclear device in Europe. Khan's role in the plan is to generate money by selling fake jewelry, such as a Fabergé egg. When this backfires, Bond is able to trace the fake egg back to Khan and uncover the sinister plot that's afoot. Khan's most iconic aspect to me is his regal faux nobility. He clearly thinks incredibly highly of himself, so much so that he tends to underestimate both allies and foes, and underestimating James Bond is a mistake very few people live to repeat. Rosa Klebb is a former SMERSH agent that has been bought by Spectre, and she is given the designation Number 3. She reports directly to Number 1, who we don't actually properly meet in From Russia with Love, but is, in fact, Ernst Stavro Blofeld. Klebb is a cold, calculating, ruthless woman that is willing to do anything to survive and accomplish her mission. We don't see evil women in James Bond that often, and one in the big bad role of a movie is even more rare, but Rosa Klebb is the first. Klebb's mission, given to her by Number 1 himself, is to take revenge for the death of Dr. Julius No, who Bond killed in the previous movie. To this end, she ropes in a young Soviet woman to seduce Bond and lure him to Istanbul, and hires a henchman, Red Grant, who we'll see later on the list. Klebb is, on the surface, an interesting character. Usually in Bond movies, the women are young, beautiful, damsels in distress, but Klebb is in her 60s, short and squat, and is incredibly dangerous and completely ruthless. In the end, however, she's just another disposable pawn on Blofeld's vast chessboard. Klebb's most iconic aspect for me has to be her weapon of choice, a retractable poisoned blade concealed in the tip of her right shoe. We see when Morzeny uses it to kill Kronstein, the poison is so effective it kills in 12 seconds.
I warn you, we do not tolerate failure, number 3. You know the penalty.
Yes. Number 1.
Our rules are very simple. If you fail...
Much like Green, Klebb feels too much like a henchwoman to me. Aside from her weapon of choice, she doesn't really do much to stand out. Aristotle Ari Christatos was a Greek heroin smuggler and an intelligence operative in For Your Eyes Only. He was hired by the KGB to acquire the ATAC device, the Automatic Targeting Attack Computer, used to coordinate the Royal Navy's Polaris nuclear-armed submarines. Christatos is manipulative, so much so that he manages to briefly trick Bond into tracking the wrong person, Milos Colombo, who ends up aiding Bond in taking Christatos down. Christatos was regarded as a hero in World War II and the Greek Civil War. The British government awarded him the King's Medal. This speaks to Christatos' level of deception and manipulation, as he was actually a double agent during both wars but was never discovered. His scheme, as mentioned above, was to acquire the British ATAC device and deliver it to the Soviet leader General Gogol. Christatos has a powerful presence. He commands attention when he's on screen, but that's more down to Julian Glover's performance than the character himself. Christatos, beyond his cunning and manipulation, is paper thin. He's a smuggler trying to make money by selling British tech and intel to the Soviets. For me, the most iconic part of his character is the sharp difference between how gentle and kindly he seems when Bond first meets him, and the cruel, cold smuggler we see later in the movie, such as when he attempts to kill Bond and Melina Havelock by tying them to the back of his yacht and dragging them over coral to cut them so that their blood will attract sharks, assuming they don't drown first. His death is also pretty memorable. He has Bond dead to rights, Bond not even aware that Christatos is about to stab him, but Colombo throws his own knife to kill Christatos and save Bond.
No, Melina. That's not the answer. We'll turn him over to the Greek police.
Out of my way, James.
All right. But be prepared to dig those 2 graves.
Emilio Largo, the villain of Thunderball, is the second in command of Spectre, given the fitting title of Number 2. He's a wealthy, Italian-born, self-styled adventurer, and he collects rare shark species for conservation purposes. That's really a front, as he receives orders directly from the leader of Spectre, Ernst Stavro Blofeld. Largo has 2 primary headquarters, 2 major locations where Bond has to interact with him. His sprawling villa Palmyra in the Bahamas, and his yacht, the Disco Volante. On his villa's grounds, he has a special pool that houses his favorite sharks, and with a series of gates, he's able to move them underwater from pool to pool, something he does to Bond after locking Bond inside one pool, though of course Bond escapes. Largo is immediately recognizable by his silver hair, eye patch, and regal Italian accent, provided by Robert Reedy, who dubbed over the actual actor, Adolfo Celli, due to Celli's voice having an accent that the director deemed a little too thick. His scheme is one of unprecedented scope, the biggest plot to that point in Bond movie history. On orders from Blofeld, Largo arranges the theft of several NATO nuclear warheads to blackmail the free world, threatening to obliterate a city in the US or UK if his demands aren't met. This plan is an oft-parodied trope, with the most notable being in the Austin Powers movies.
Oh, hell, let's just do what we always do. Hijack some nuclear weapons and hold the world hostage.
For the most part, the plan goes well. Largo's men are able to successfully capture the bombs, and Spectre even issues their demands, but Bond tracks Largo down and ultimately foils the plot, culminating in his death at the hands of the movie's Bond girl, Domino, in revenge for killing her brother earlier in the movie.
I'm glad I killed him.
You're glad.
Largo is clearly sociopathic. He's able to fake real emotions, such as his pretended love for Domino and the way he clearly has no problem murdering anyone that gets in his way. While other Spectre agents react with shock and horror when Blofeld executes traitorous subordinates, Largo only displays casual indifference, even when witnessing a man violently electrocuted by Blofeld.
I've decided on the appropriate action.
Largo is the first entry on this list that really feels like a villain in his own right to me. Yes, he follows Blofeld's orders, but he really takes his own initiative, operates freely, and has a whole division of Spectre under his control. However, every single entry above him is more of a villain or does something extra to really stand out. General Orlov is the second of the two major antagonists in Octopussy, and is fanatically devoted to the Soviet Union. Orlov believes that the Warsaw Pact is superior to NATO in terms of raw military strength, and that strength is being thrown away by the Soviet leaders in détente. To that end, he wants to launch a massive attack on Western Europe to call NATO's bluff on nuclear retaliation. When Orlov's invasion plan is rejected, it's clear that the other leaders on the Soviet War Council regard him as a madman, and General Gogol, who we've seen in several movies prior and several after, seems to find Orlov contemptible and his thirst for power worrying. Orlov's plan is to sneak a nuclear device into the US Air Force base in Feldstadt, West Germany, and detonate it. The blast would be indistinguishable from American nuclear bombs, and thus would mistakenly be believed to be a nuclear accident. A real nuclear strike would trigger the Air Force's early warning system, and the nuclear disaster would lead to complete nuclear disarmament, making Orlov's plan to invade the West much easier, as there would be no way to retaliate with nuclear missiles. Orlov has a rather iconic death scene that really speaks to his manic fixation on the USSR. He's shot in the back by border guards, and when General Gogol calls him out as a disgrace, Orlov doesn't seem to mind his own death, as he believes that when his plan succeeds, he will be posthumously honored as a hero.
A common thief, a disgrace to the uniform.
Yes, but tomorrow I shall be a hero of the Soviet Union.
I like Orlov more than any of the previous entries because he really captures the crazy, not stupid personality that makes many Bond villains so iconic. Orlov has no issue with thousands of innocent people dying if it means his goals are achieved. Besides Orlov's death, his most iconic aspect for me is his fanatical devotion to the Soviet Union. We see plenty of madmen and terrorists in the Bond movies, but Orlov isn't a freelancer out to make money. He's in it because he legitimately believes that he'll be saving the Soviet Union.
Me. It was all me, James. It's always been me, the author of all your pain.
What? Blofeld this low on the list? Yes. Remember that, in the beginning of the video, I said that I'd have two entries for Blofeld, one for the classic version and one for the more modern reboot movies. Let's get this out of the way first. I love Christoph Waltz. The man is a phenomenal, fantastic actor. He was incredible in Django Unchained and Inglourious Basterds, and I adored him in Alita Battle Angel. However, the character he plays in Spectre and No Time to Die doesn't feel like Blofeld to me. This version of Blofeld, originally named Franz Oberhauser, is, gasp, Bond's secret foster brother. In my opinion, this is a really dumb addition to the character, only added in to explain away why Spectre was secretly manipulating Bond and making him suffer so that the reveal of Spectre would feel more impactful, as the studio didn't have the rights to use the Spectre organization or Blofeld himself until the 2015 Spectre movie. As we'll see later in the list, I believe that Blofeld should be portrayed as a deadly serious, cold, calculating, brilliant criminal mind. The reboot's Blofeld feels more like a cartoon character, less Moriarty and more Dr. Claw. This is perfectly exemplified with his semi-frequent cuckoo, cuckoo.
You know what happens when a cuckoo hatches inside another bird's nest.
Yes. It forces the other eggs out.
Yes. Well, this cuckoo made me realize my father's life had to end. In a way, he's responsible for the path I took. So thank you, cuckoo.
I respect the monologue that leads up to it. making an analogy to a cuckoo bird placing its egg in another bird's nest and pushing the other eggs out. But the little playful cuckoo at the end just feels like a cartoon character, rather than a cold, nigh emotionless, evil mastermind. One thing I do really like is his level of cruelty. It really fits the character's sadistic personality, such as when he tortures Bond in the Spectre movie. This Blofeld's plan is considerably less involved than many of classic Blofeld's schemes. There are two goals. First, establish the Nine Eyes program to give full, unfettered global surveillance and thus making MI6 obsolete, which will allow Spectre to operate freely without interference from spies like Bond. And second, make James Bond's life a living hell. His death in No Time to Die is also incredibly underwhelming. Bond has been infected with a specialized DNA-targeted weapon, and when Blofeld taunts Bond, Bond starts to choke him, only for the weapon in Bond's blood to kill Blofeld in seconds. In my opinion, the big bad of the Bond franchise should go out in a big fight, something that actually puts Bond in danger, makes him struggle and overcome Blofeld. This is so much weaker and more pathetic. The only reason why this version of Blofeld isn't lower on my list is because, at his best, he's a scary, omnipresent villain, which Christoph Waltz brings forth expertly. On rewatching the Craig-era movies, you can sort of feel him in the shadows, even knowing that he wasn't really there. Karl Stromberg, the villain of The Spy Who Loved Me, is a megalomaniacal billionaire and founder and CEO of Stromberg Shipping. He believes that humanity is beyond saving, and to that end intends to end the world and remake it. Stromberg is a presence whenever he's on screen. He oozes arrogance and the kind of charisma that only the self-important possess, and that's helped immensely by Kurt Jürgens' cold, emotionless performance. He really sells the detached, sociopathic nature of the character. Stromberg's evil scheme, and one he nearly achieves, is to hijack a pair of nuclear-capable submarines, first the Russian Potemkin and then the British HMS Ranger, then fire nuclear missiles at both Moscow and London and blame the attacks on the opposing governments, igniting a nuclear war to wipe out humanity so Stromberg can rebuild civilization in Atlantis, his undersea base. In an effort to conceal his plans from the governments he was intending to target, Stromberg systematically eliminated anyone that even came close to uncovering his plot, going so far as to hire one of the greatest mercenaries and henchmen in cinematic history, Jaws. However, eventually, his plan was uncovered by the dual efforts of British agent 007 James Bond and Russian agent XXX Anya Amasova, and the two took Stromberg down together. Stromberg's death has elicited some controversy and questions in the James Bond fan community. Stromberg fires a rocket gun mounted under his table at Bond, and when Bond dodges, he puts his Walther PPK up against the rocket gun's barrel and fires into it.
You've shot your boat, Stromberg. Now it's my turn.
I've seen a lot of people say that doing this wouldn't have hit Stromberg as the weapon is in the way. My interpretation of it has always been that the first shot into the barrel destroyed the gun, sending shards of plastic and metal into Stromberg's abdomen, and Bond's follow-up shots were what actually killed Stromberg. As someone that loves aquatic life, I really enjoyed the whole aesthetic and atmosphere of Stromberg's locales. The giant shark tank, the elegant viewing window, it's great. The reason that Stromberg is this low on the list is simply because his plan doesn't really seem to make sense. We'll see later that there's a villain with a somewhat similar plan, but it doesn't leave nuclear fallout across the planet. Further, Stromberg doesn't seem to have gathered enough people to really make a civilization undersea. Stromberg claims that he wants to wipe out life on land so that the sea can prosper, but the oceans would absolutely be affected by a nuclear holocaust. Of course, the most iconic thing about Stromberg for me is his lair. Atlantis is a beautiful but intimidating fortress that can easily sink beneath the waves to hide from threats, and it plays a huge role in the final act of the movie, including Bond and Jaws fighting. When I made this list, I promised myself that I would try to keep personal bias out of it, but with Lucifer Safin, the villain of the most recent Bond movie, at time of recording, I can't entirely dismiss my own feelings about the movie. No Time to Die is up there with Quantum of Solace as my least favorite Bond movie. Sure, it has some solid action scenes, but it stumbles in so many other areas, such as killing Blofeld almost casually. However, where it falls on its face for me is at the end, where they kill James Bond. You do not kill James Bond. Doing my best to separate character from movie, Safin is a great villain in his own right. Played by Rami Malek with a cold, unfeeling vibe, Safin is, in many ways, a foil to Bond himself. Like Bond, he lost his parents as a child. Safin's parents were killed on Blofeld's orders, and the poison gas Mr. White used that killed Safin's family left Safin himself as the only survivor, though he was disfigured, traumatized, and left with nothing but hate and a desire for vengeance on the organization that destroyed his life, Spectre. Safin pursued his vengeance and hunted down Mr. White, the father of Bond's love interest, Madeline Swan, though he only found Swan and her mother, who he killed, only to be shot and wounded by the child. Safin pursued Swan, and when she fell into a frozen lake, he saved her life rather than killing her, then left. Safin's plan was simple, the death of every single member of Spectre. To that end, he acquired Heracles, a nanovirus that could be programmed to target DNA, and he released it at a meeting of all surviving Spectre members in Cuba, killing them all save for Blofeld. Safin orchestrated the insertion of Heracles into the prison where Blofeld was being held, using Swan's daughter as leverage, though the killing blow was ultimately delivered by Bond, who had touched the infected Madeline and then attempted to strangle Blofeld, which triggered the virus to kill Blofeld. Safin is one of very few villains in Bond history to fully complete his plan. Safin's lair is a small island known as the Poison Garden, which was a chemical manufacturing plant located in the Sea of Japan near Okhotsk, and is where the nanovirus Heracles was developed. This island was deemed so potentially dangerous to the free world that a nuclear strike was ordered on it. Bond ultimately sacrificed himself to ensure that the Cold War-era blast doors were open so that the facility within could be destroyed. Safin also had a decent death, a struggle with Bond culminating in Bond triple-tapping Safin in the head. I think the most iconic aspect of Safin for me is his personality. He was cold, calculating, and rarely, if ever, got angry. Even in his pursuit of revenge, he set aside the anger that could distract him and focused entirely on the goal itself. Safin was a cruel man, willing to take children hostage, taunting Bond, and releasing a bioweapon that could theoretically kill millions if left unchecked. He also had no problem with dying if his goals were achieved. General Georgy Koskov, one of the two primary villains from Timothy Dalton's first outing as Bond, The Living Daylights, is a Russian general who is really in it for himself, and to that end, plays both sides of the Cold War. Koskov fakes his defection by having his girlfriend, and later Bond girl, pose as a KGB sniper to shoot a blank at him as he escapes, then points to the KGB head general Leonid Pushkin as the one behind the Smert-Spionen plot, Death to Spies, which was supposedly a plan to kill American and British spies, before his own henchman Nekros kidnaps him back. Koskov's plan is to use stolen Soviet funds to buy opium worth $500 million from the Mujahideen, and then to work with Brad Whitaker, an American arms dealer, to distribute the drugs in the US for massive profit, and buy advanced arms from Whitaker to increase the Soviet presence in Afghanistan to prolong the fighting and sell more weapons. Interestingly, Koskov is never killed on screen. His death is implied, but never canonically stated. He is arrested by Pushkin, and while Pushkin does imply that Koskov is a traitor and will be executed, we never get confirmation that it happened. This is one of only 2 times that a main villain hasn't died on screen, the other being Dominic Green from Quantum of Solace. For me, the most memorable thing about Koskov is how endearing he is in the beginning of the movie. He appears overjoyed to see Bond as the one helping him defect, terrified with the plans to get him out, and delighted to see Bond again at the safe house. This is a perfect contrast to his cold, cruel personality later on. Donald Red Grant is the secondary antagonist of From Russia with Love. He's an assassin and is hired by Rosa Klebb for the sole purpose of eliminating anyone and everyone that comes into contact with the Soviet Lecter that Bond was recovering, then to kill Bond and Tatiana Romanova so Spectre could take the Lecter and sell it to a client. Grant was convicted of murder, but in 1960 he broke out of prison and was later recruited by Spectre and trained as an assassin. His cold-blooded nature, lack of inhibitions, and raw physicality, seen when Klebb punches him in the stomach with knuckle dusters to see how tough he is and Grant not flinching, make him an excellent assassin. Grant tracks Bond and the Lecter and does his job, killing every single person that Bond contacts about the Lecter, and eventually tracking Bond onto the Orient Express where he impersonates an ally, a British agent named Nash, to get close to Bond. He ultimately underestimates Bond, believing he's won, and lets his greed get the better of him, which lets Bond trick him into detonating a tear gas cartridge in his face. Bond overpowers him and strangles him with his own garrote. Grant always stood out to me because of his ability, like Bond, to be both cold and suave. He's able to put on a British accent, join Bond for dinner, be polite and friendly, then turn around and murder Bond's friends on the train moments later. In my opinion, that sort of contrast makes for a good villain. This video is way too long to have it as a single segment, so we're going to stop here, and part 2 will be up fairly soon after this one goes live. Thanks for watching, and stay tuned for part 2. Please consider liking, commenting, and subscribing. It takes 2 seconds for you and really helps the channel out. See you in part 2.